Oh, so fabulous.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel once again. It's your girl Dumebi. If this is your first time coming across my channel, you're welcome. I do hope you decide to subscribe, and if you are a returning subscriber, you guys know that I love you. It's so good to have you here. Welcome back. So today we're going over to the continent of Africa. I came across this video of one of our African sisters talking about how Africa is not poor because of colonialism, that we should not blame the poverty and the underdevelopment of Africa on colonialism, right? You know what? Let me just go right ahead and play her video.
Today, Singapore is richer than its ex-colonizer, Great Britain. So when I hear people telling me today, oh, Africa is poor because of colonization, I'm like, please, let's move on from that. Does it have maybe a tiny percentage in where we are today? Maybe, and I don't know. But I know it's not the cause. Because if it were, many countless countries have been colonized before. And by the way, colonizing one another is humanity's history. It just happened that maybe Africa has been one of the last, colonized region in the world. So in our psyche, it is there, and it acts like nothing happened before to others. But flash news, it's the history of the world. We've been capturing each other back and forth, all of that. So anyway, but the truth is, Singapore, richer than Great Britain today. And then Hong Kong happened. And then because Hong Kong happened, China even today happened. Because China's like, wait a minute, what went on over there? And then China went on to do the exact same thing with its SEZs, the special economic zones, some of the most free market zones in the world. And then look at it happen in communist China, who, when it comes to economics, decided that we're going to do the free market, we're going to be capitalist, because that's the only way. We tried everything else. We hundreds of millions of people, and we have nothing to show for it. But now that we're tired of being disrespected members of society, because guess what? That's the other thing too. You want to be respected in this world, you're going to have to be among the prosperous ones for other reasons. Would it be nice, G, that we respect people just because? Absolutely. But that's really not the world we live in. So when China got tired of being disrespected, they're like, maybe we got to build also some prosperity here, because then they're going to hear us. And today, China, being one of the, being where it is at, even Hollywood, who tries to tell the world how to think, is being told by China what movies to make and how to tweak stories and history in order to be palatable for them. You see the power that comes with being prosperous.
So in that video, there were some people agreeing with her. There were some palm-colored folks there, of course, agreeing with her. Some African people, black people agreeing with her as well. And there were some people disagreeing with her. And obviously, there are some stitches that have been made. So I'm just going to go right ahead and play different stitches and responses to her commentary.
Me today, oh, Africa is poor because of colonization. I'm like,
well, yes, it is. Because different regions of the British Empire got different functionalities for this empire. For example, some regions are designed for them to migrate to, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These regions will form into a market that majority of its societies are white people, and so they can do business, and also they can migrate to. And some regions like Hong Kong and Singapore, their functionality is to be a port for them, so they can transfer their goods. And also these cities can sooner form into a business market for them as well. And these cities can be rich. And some places, they have much resource. And those places are for the British Empire to exploit. For example, Africa and India. That's why these countries are poor, because the British Empire don't have the desire or any will to build these countries, to develop these countries, because they don't care. They just want to exploit these countries. And that's why these countries still can't recover from the exploitations until today, because their functionalities are not for developing a good market for British Empire. They're just simply exploitation farm for the British Empire. And people always use Singapore and Hong Kong compare with these regions that got exploited and saying that colonization is not bad. And I will say they don't know a bit about history at all.
Africa is poor because of colonization. I'm like, please, let's move on from that.
So the level of ignorance this lady displayed in this particular video is too much. And I'm happy that most people told her that she's ignorant. In fact, this lady is ignorant. She doesn't understand how the world works. She's basically ignorant. His, basis for his argument is weak. She's trying to compare an entire continent to one country, China, and Singapore. You are trying to, your comparison doesn't even make sense. Now you are saying that Great Britain colonized Singapore, and today Singapore is rich. The British, they left Singapore, or neo-colonial project is not alive in Singapore today because Singapore have no better resource, right? And the Western America didn't build their economies at the expense of Singapore's economy. The Western America target Africa. They build their economies at the expense of we Africans' economies. So neo-colonial project is still alive in Africa. When we talk about colonization, some people, they think colonization has ended. No, slavery has ended, but neo-colonial project is alive. So it's not a thing of the past. It's still happening. You see, you're trying to compare us to China. What is the population of China? Almost 1.5 billion people, right? And China is one country. Africa is still fighting to even unite. And the West keep on killing our leaders. All the leaders who try to unite Africa, they kill us. Africa is divided. We call it divide and conquer. So they deliberately divided Africa into pieces in order to exploit Africa. Some African countries are not even allowed to even spend their own currency. They have to still spend the colonial master currency. And some have tried their possible best to get out of this situation, but the Western America still, they kill their leaders, right? You cannot blame everything entirely on us. We are also trying our best on the continent. Looking at this lady, I can see that she grew up in the West and basically, she's saying what she has been told to say because she have no idea what is actually happening on the continent. She's ignorant. She doesn't know anything about African politics, history. He got it wrong. Everything, this woman got it wrong. She have no idea what is happening on the continent. Now, both China and Singapore, they are all in Asia. Are you trying to tell me that all Asian countries are wealthy? Are you trying to tell me that all the countries in Asia are rich? There are some countries in Asia who are extremely poor even more than Africa, right? So you don't compare a single country to an entire continent, then you blame us.
I hear people telling me today, oh, Africa is poor because of colonization. I'm like, please, let's move on from that.
So this is a very interesting and popular argument, so let's talk about it for a little bit. What I would like to do right now, as opposed to advocating for one side or the other, is provide both sides of this argument. Because this topic is fairly nuanced and fairly complicated, both sides usually misrepresent each other fairly often. So what I would like to do is talk about some of the literature and the theories behind this argument. A perfect representation of what this argument really is can be found in the title of two books. This one, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, and this one, How Africa Underdevelops Africa by Stanley Igwe. The names of these two books obviously gives a pretty solid overview of what this argument really is. In How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney unapologetically argues that as Africa was developing Europe, Europe was systematically underdeveloping the continent. Europe deliberately and drastically exploited Africa, and the effects of this exploitation can still be seen politically and economically on the continent today. The idea here was that any idea that capitalism brought by Europeans somehow helped Africa financially is a myth, it's a mirage. In reality, Africans need to understand what capitalism is and the damage and destruction, the carnage it's brought on our continent. This is Rodney's argument. Igwe, on the other hand, admittedly claims that his book is not necessarily meant to replace Walter Rodney's, mostly because that would be pretty difficult to do. Rodney's is a classic. And Igwe acknowledges that Rodney's book still has a place in the discourse here. However, he feels like a part of the argument that's important as well is the roles that African leaders played in the underdevelopment of our countries. Igwe argues that the origin of poverty and underdevelopment in Africa can be traced to Marxism and what could be called the blame colonialism game. Igwe articulates an argument somewhat similar to another passionate voice in this debate, the Ghanaian economist George Ayete. Ayete argues in several books that African problems require African solutions. And he claims that a lot of African leaders are always running to the West, either for ideas or for handouts. And their constant desire to play the victim card while berating the West, while at the same time constantly asking the West for money, is what's leading to Africa's economic collapse. In this particular book, Africa Betrayed, Ayete basically goes off on a lot of African leaders and points out all of their shortcomings and all of the ways that they have destroyed the continent. But on the other side of this argument, we have to consider the concept of neocolonialism, according to Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah argued that independence did not bring the end of colonialism. Instead, colonialism changed into something else. It evolved into a new form of imperialism called neocolonialism. The idea here is that Europe still controls the economies of African countries, and they do this in ways that are more subtle than the obvious methods that were employed during formal colonialism. For example, it can be colonialism through giving loans and having African countries be stuck in debt. It also manifests itself in having African countries be in a politically dependent state to the West. That is, we depend on them for things like military aid. It can also manifest itself in the exploitation of resources and labor. And the idea here is that while some versions of the argument on this side of the whole thing might say that now that colonialism is over, the only people to blame would be Africans, this side of the argument would point out that neocolonialism is a factor here. Also, in the full version of the video that played at the start of part 1, the lady says something along the lines of, Singapore was also colonized by the British, but these days Singapore is doing very well. Therefore, Africa has no excuse. That is a somewhat common argument on this side of the aisle. To counter it, we have to understand what colonialism truly was. And the fundamental question here is, was colonialism in Africa different? Frantz Fanon argues that colonialism was a dehumanizing and a very violent process. So the question we must ask is, was this process dehumanizing and violent everywhere it came up, or was this unique to Africa? The United States was a British colony. Was the colonial experience in America dehumanizing and violent? The dehumanizing nature of colonialism in Africa led to people being stripped of their history, of their culture, of their identities, of their humanity. The colonizer creates a Manichaean world, and the colonized are forced to live and exist within this world. And so we must ask the question if this idea of colonialism applies to every instance of colonialism everywhere it has emerged around the world. And so we could say that comparing Africa to Singapore in this case is a bit misguided. There's a whole field of post-colonial studies that talks about the effect of colonization on nations and how they now exist as post-colonies. And these theories, these ideas, these philosophies of what it means to be a post-colony do not apply to everyone. So there's a strong argument to be made that the colonial experience in Africa was different. But there's one more important factor we have to keep in mind. That is the question of agency. A great book with brilliant arguments is the book Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously by Olufemi Taiwo. Taiwo, simply put, is not a fan of the concept of decolonization, and he argues against it in this book. There are many arguments he makes regarding this, and I can't go through all of them here. I would recommend interacting with Taiwo's own work and wrestling with his arguments yourself. One of the key themes here is the idea of agency. The idea here is that with freedom comes choice. And after the period of formal colonization, African leaders were in a position where they made choices. And if they were exercising their agency to make their own choices, then their mistakes are theirs. And if their mistakes aren't theirs, we run the risk of infantilizing them and stripping them of their agency. It's like if you're in a public place and a little kid comes up to you and curses you out or gives you the middle finger. You could probably be mad at the kid, but you probably ask where the kid's parent is. Because sure, you can blame the kid, but only to a certain extent. They are a child. Their agency is limited. You call their parent, you blame their parent, you yell at their parent. And the idea here is that if African leaders do things that are wrong, do things that are dumb, do things that are bad for their countries, and we constantly point the finger at Europe, we are treating African leaders like children. We are treating African nations as though they are not sovereign nations. We are pointing the finger at their parent. And if Europe is forever going to be the spiritual parent of Africa, that will forever strip Africans of any agency we might have. And the question that pops out of this is, was colonialism, as violent and as tragic and as horrible as it was it the event in African history, or was it simply an event, one event in the long histories of many of these nations? And so if we are to take the agency of Africans seriously, we cannot continue claiming that they are mere puppets in all of these games the Europeans are playing. We have to treat African nations and their leaders as adults. But at the same time, with the role economics plays in our world today, neocolonialism could be growing stronger. And neocolonialism, when combined with the psychological damage caused by the colonial experience in Africa, truly might play a bigger role than some on this side of the argument might want to admit. In either case, this is a very brief summary of both sides of this argument. I do hope you'll give all of these books a read, because they're a fun time. And I hope that we can all engage with these arguments, because both sides really do want what is best for the continent. That's important to keep in mind. So yes, I look forward to a great discussion based on these arguments.
So yeah, I think what they said, especially that last commenter, you guys, when I watched that guy talk, even though his commentary was long, I felt like I was in class getting an education. And he had all those book recommendations that if you're interested in this kind of topic about the motherland, about Africa, to know why we are still struggling with the things we are struggling and the effects of colonialism and neo-colonialism and development in Africa and all of that stuff, check out that book, right? So the thing is, when we sit down and say Africa is the way it is, we have all these challenges in Africa, in our countries in Africa, because I keep saying Africa, I don't want anybody to think it's one country, because I realize a lot of people that are not Africans think Africa is a country. No, Africa is made up of 54 different countries, and no, not every country in Africa was colonized. Let's get that out of the way. So now, there's a part of me that knows and admits that if we say that Africa is the way it is, that the state we are in, the struggles we have, the underdevelopment, the poverty and all of that is strictly as an after effect of colonialism, it's going to be a form of victimhood. It's going to be a form of us not even admitting the role we had to play as a people, you know, our leaders and all of that. As much as we are victims, we definitely do have the power to a large extent to change the outcome, right? So now, I think it was an unfair comparison for her to compare us to some of the other countries, because the kind of colonialism that we experienced was different. They came here and they did a lot of things. They took some of our people over there to build their countries, and we just got our independence recently, actually. Nigeria got its independence in 1960, so we're just 63 years old as a country. So you cannot compare us to some other countries that have had a lot of time to build. Even America itself was colonized, wasn't it? Now, this particular video that this guy made actually made me see things in a different way that I didn't even know before, being that it was a different kind of colonialism that they gave us because of the way Africa is set up, because of the manpower that they saw here, which enabled them to take some of our people to go build their country, and because of the natural resources that we had. So they had to do it in such a way that we can never really break free from their shackles, because they always want to have some certain level of control over us. They always want us to be somehow dependent on them in such a way that they say they are giving us aid and helping us out, but they just want us to be indebted to them and therefore keep that relationship so that they can always come back here and take these resources and build their country with it. That is still happening. Look at countries in Africa that are mining, children that are being used in these harsh conditions. Look at them going to different African countries talking about how they're going to give them aid and then trying to force them to accept one policy or the other, or come to some kind of agreement that leaves the African people at a disadvantage. I mean, it's been happening, right? The lady that made this video, I'm sure she must have heard of neo-colonialism. Now, I did my research. Let me read what I saw on Google when I checked it out. Neo-colonialism is the continuation of reimposition of imperialist rule by a state, usually a former colonial power, over another normally independent state, usually a former colony. And it takes the form of economic imperialism, globalization, cultural imperialism, and continual aid to influence or control a developing country instead of the previous colonial methods of direct military control or indirect political control. Now, there was another article that I saw that kind of struck me when I googled some African countries that are experiencing neo-colonialism. Now, I went to the French-speaking countries in Africa. France's former African colonies are celebrating 60 years of independence. That's basically like the same as us. But France's influence remains all-pervasive, and critics say it is time that Africans cut the umbilical cord and put an end to Franc Afrique. 60 years on, that is 60 years after the independence, Francophone countries in Africa still do not have true independence and freedom from France, says Nathalie Yamp, advisor to Ivory Coast Freedom and Democracy Party. Even the content of school textbooks is still determined by France, she added. What are we talking about? The level of control. And look at what struck me. She said, shortly before independence, France decided to abolish the parliamentary system of some countries like Ivory Coast and introduce a presidential regime in which all territories and powers are in the hands of the head of state. Yamp told DW, the reason being that in this way, only one person with all the power needs to be manipulated. So, now, I know that when these colonial masters, when these colonizers came into Africa, they looked for the people that will be more susceptible to being controlled. The people that they could use. Once they convince these ones, those ones will do the work for them to convince the others. And then they also use the method of divide and conquer, because remember, Africa is made up of different tribes, right? Different ethnic groups. So they use divide and conquer to make us all not be able to stand as one, and then they came and acted like the good people, uniting all of us, forming countries, creating borders, and then they were able to rule. When they left, those people that they know they had an agreement with, that were the ethnic groups that were more susceptible to them or more gullible, those were the particular people that they left in power. In my country, if you're Nigerian, you know, we know the ethnic group that holds most of the political power in our country. Those are the people. And in Nigeria, this was just 63 years ago. So we know that it's been a recycling of these same men in power, these same leaders that made this agreement with those colonial masters. Is the same people that have been recycled to us as presidents. It's in Africa that you're going to see a president that has ruled for decades. So it is still the same people that these colonizers have an influence and an agreement with that are still in power. So how is Africa supposed to move forward? How? Then when there's a leader that wants to really stand up and fight for his people in Africa, that wants to cut off from colonizers and do what is best for our people, they remove him. You know what I mean by remove? This is what I'm saying. Like, in as much as we can blame colonialism for where we are in Africa, we can also blame the inefficiency of some of our leaders, a lot of our leaders actually in Africa. So it's a two-way street, because a lot of these people are not thinking about how to do what's best for their people. They're thinking about themselves and their generation and their family. And it's just sad. That level of selfishness is just, that's the problem I think Africa has. So I think that lady is wrong, because we can't really say that the colonizers are not to blame for what is happening in Africa, but still our people are still giving them the power generation after generation, decade after decade. And I think, I don't know, to think of how religious we are in Africa, I don't know if we're expecting God to come down from heaven and do things for us, but there's only so many kind of prayers we can pray. We just have to do these things ourselves. And I hope that it happens in my lifetime and in my generation. Anyway, you guys, let me know what you think about this in the comment section. What is your opinion? Do you think that Africa is the way it is as an effect of colonialism, or do you think we've had enough time to be able to build ourselves and we're just at this point we're our own problem? Let me know what you think about these two sides of the argument in the comment section. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.